insane.
Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Hidden Perspective. This is Rob Greco. It's good to be back, joined by Jules. Jules, how you going?
Very well, mate. Very well. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling fresh. I've been sleeping better. It's been good.
What was wrong with your sleep before?
But I've as well as not doing that anymore, I'm also trying to get some sunlight in my eyes early in the morning, and that seems to be making a massive difference. So I've been going through these morning walks, and if you get sunlight in your eyes in the first 2 hours after sunrise, sort of sets off all these important circadian rhythms. So it's like waking up because the sun's risen, right? Before we lived in houses and were as inoculated from the sun as we are now. But anyway, I seem to wake up better, but I think the key thing is by the evening I'm very tired, so it's good. Try not to look at bright lights in the evening and sleeping well.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I remember us chatting about this. I had my first bouts of insomnia only a few weeks ago, the first time in my life I've ever had terrible sleep. It's horrifying going to bed and just never falling asleep. But yeah, I think the walks definitely did help, walking at sunset and sunrise. But also just like making sure that you kind of tire yourself out. You know, always doing exercise, typical rhythm. Well, for today's episode, we Jules and I stumbled on an article which was worthy of discussion. So, Jules, do you want to quickly describe the article that caught your attention?
So the headline is Indigenous Academic Apologizes for Calling African Crime Study Racist. So the research was done into South Sudanese crime in Victoria by the author of the report was Dr. Stephane Shepherd, who himself is African-Australian. He was born in Mauritius, and he co-authored a paper. He's an associate professor at Swinburne, and the paper was called Estimating the Extent and Nature of Offending by Sudanese-Born Individuals in Victoria. Anyway, he was called racist by this Twitter account and this other academic. Her name was called Dr. Amanda Porter. Now, Dr. Amanda Porter is an Indigenous Australian and an academic, and her Twitter feed, before she deleted it, was focused on calling out certain kinds of research and explaining how they were sort of racist. Now, she went to town on this on her Twitter thread. Unfortunately, we can't go back and read you her arguments as she deleted them all, including her whole account. So clearly this article and the amount of press that was generated probably resulted in a bunch of backlash towards her. I'm assuming part of it was inappropriate because after I Googled it, I saw that the Herald Sun and all these other people jumped on this. So my guess is she was probably experienced a bunch of unfortunate criticisms, but we're not going to say anything mean about her, but we are going to talk about the broader implications of this article, research done that focuses on particular ethnic groups and just generally, what's important here.
Yeah. So let's go to Dr. Shepherd and his actual research. So what did he actually look at?
So he looked at...
Actually, go even one step back. So what's the broader context in which this article sits and in which the research sits? So in Victoria, maybe over the last 10 years, would you say? Maybe 5 years, there's been this...
no, I think 10 years.
Yeah. So this idea circulating that certain immigrant groups from Sudan have been disproportionately representing the crime stats. So they've been committing more crime than their population, than their percentage within the population would suggest. So that's obviously sparked a concern over racism, whether people were genuinely, just perceiving them to have committed more crime because of their own racism, or whether this was actually happening, or another question, whether the only reason why they were committing more crime is because they were being over-policed and there was some racial profiling going on. So then this researcher comes in, Dr. Shepherd, and what did he look at?
So he tried to examine whether or not, whether there's any evidence to show that they are overrepresented, and I guess B, the extent to which racism was playing a role in those statistics. And neither of us are criminologists, Rob, so I'm not in a position to speak to the rigor of the research. What I do know is that it was published in an important accredited journal, and obviously, Swinburne University is a real university. But basically, what he showed was that, which other crime statistics I've seen speak to this issue have shown, which is that Sudanese youth, and in particular males, they aren't overrepresented in like drug crime or possession crimes or public disturbance crimes, public alcoholism crimes. So the idea, the reason you check for those crimes is because, or traffic crimes, because they're considered to an extent discretionary police crimes. So that's to say that, like, if a cop is racist, he's going to be constantly pulling over black people for traffic crimes, or if a cop is racist, he'll be booking people for being drunk in public when, if you walk down, Brunswick Street in Fitzroy at 2 a.m., you'll find, every second, white person wasted. So they don't get pulled over for those crimes. What they are sort of remarkably overrepresented in, like incredibly overrepresented in, is violent burglaries, violent robberies, crimes against the person is a way to define these crimes. So assaults, violent assaults. And because of this, they're massively overrepresented in prison populations. Right. Because if you beat someone up and burgle and rob them, you generally get sentenced to prison. So his argument was that there is problems in the community, and that there isn't really evidence to show that this overrepresentation in crime has much to do with at least the police being racist.
Right. At least because that category of crimes against the person, have less discretionary capability involved on the part of the police officers. So you can't really discriminate in the way you police for a burglary because that either happened or it didn't, as opposed to screening people on the street and then pulling them over because you suspect that something's gone wrong. Right.
Like, yeah, correct. It's not like, they were found to be carrying more knives than the average citizen, or, their stats that are thrown around, in England and stuff. Yeah. This is actually, crimes against people, them calling the police and asking for help. So, and I guess you'd say that mirrors the media experience of these crimes anyway, which is to say, I don't consume a ton of mainstream media, but you do, every now and again, and see a filmed home invasion, particularly in the outer western suburbs, where you'll see, criminals smash down doors in someone's home, carrying baseball bats, and then generally what happens is they steal a bunch of shit. They steal the car of the residents. Yeah. They run away. They eventually torch the car. Yeah. Carjackings, yeah. They torch the car, and then and especially when there's footage of it, it ends up straight in the middle of some viral media, because we all love living vicariously through the pain and suffering of others, don't we, Rob? Yeah. One thing I'll say there is I find it, when people claim that the media is racist for showing some home invasion done by African youths, I find that totally unpersuasive, because the media would show any filmed home invasion. And I do think you can actually see here in the statistics that the second most represented ethnic group in home invasions is by a mile South Sudanese people, and they make up less than like 1% of the population. So, I feel like if Channel 7 is going, or Channel 10 or whatever, these media outlets, they have built into them this perverse desire to show disgusting things, happening. And I think they're just as likely to show a home invasion committed by non-Africans or white people as they are black people. Like, I feel like, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
I don't know. I don't know exactly what I think on that. I mean, I can see someone arguing the opposite end of the spectrum and saying a video footage of a Sudanese home invasion is much likely to generate traction and virality on the internet because there's a certain subsection of the population who gets animated by that, the, I guess, racist subpopulation of Australia, and they're going to share that more often. It's going to be viral, and it's going to be used as justification for their views that these maybe certain groups shouldn't be let into Australia. So I can almost see an incentive on the part of media companies to show something that is racialized, but I don't have any evidence that does happen and that they get overshared,
right? So
in comparison to their crime rate,
I would agree with that. So 100%, and also the idea, also the other issue is if it's committed by people of ethnic neutrality, if that's a thing. It's their ethnicity isn't defined, right? They'll say what the identifying features of those people are if they've got, if they weren't wearing balaclavas or whatever. But it is. I'm sure it goes more viral when it's by a racial minority because, as you've said, all the races get to jump up and down. But the amount of times I've seen a tram bashing or some sort of mugging or any kind of awful crime, I mean, this is the stuff that makes television go, right? It's like, it's like, nightmarish, your nightmare shown in footage. Our youth have gone insane. And then, there's some, it's like, this is what media is for. So I guess that's just the point. It's like, as if the media isn't going to show it, and I don't think it makes them inherently racist that they do show it, but it probably does prey on the racism that exists. I would accept that.
Yeah. Plays on some xenophobic fears and
sure.
For sure. But that's only really the context of what all of this is about. So this Dr. Shepherd, an African Australian of mixed French and African descent, he comes out with this study, and the study doesn't show that there's racial profiling, and he says that they are actually overrepresented in crime stats because it appears that they do just commit this crime more frequently than other group identities. And I think a really important thing to note is that all of this is a group identity, so it's inherently imprecise. I think a lot of these studies, I'm not too sure if exactly this one did, but there's a lot more variance within a particular group than there is a variance across groups. So, just because you can know group differences, it doesn't mean you could say with any particular certainty, if you were asked to pick who is more violent, a white person or a person of Sudanese descent, just because you know these slight group differences, that gives you a really low probability of being able to pick that anyway, which is an inherent problem with that type of research, which maybe we can get into. But anyway, so he has this finding, and then Dr. Stephanie
Amanda Porter.
Amanda Porter. She works for the Melbourne University Law School within Indigenous Studies, and she calls racism. And do you want to continue the story from here, Jules?
Yeah, well, she criticises the way the research was done, its implications. She calls it racist. That it lacked academic integrity. She couldn't believe that it was in the journal that it was in. And that resulted in Dr. Shepherd feeling like his entire reputation had been tarnished, that he'd thought about quitting. And, in particular, however, she did then, after speaking to him, and I believe finding out that he was African, gave him a formal written apology.
Well, that's generous.
Yeah. So
that actually reminds me. Just a quick segue. So I believe it was a few years ago. The Black American economist Thomas Sowell, famous economist, free market, conservative, leaning economist. He's a prolific writer, academic. Has been writing books for generations. He, argued, debated with Milton Friedman. He's been a part of the economic establishment for 50 years. Serious academic, even if you disagree with his views of the world. But he published a book a few years ago, and it was reviewed by the London School of Economics Book Review. So you would think a pretty credible organization to review a book, especially the London School of Economics, very credible in the economics profession. This person doing the book review gave her a critique, and there was basically a little throwaway paragraph to say it's easy to understand why Thomas Sowell has this view of the world as a white man. And obviously, if you know Thomas Sowell, he's clearly not white. He's been around for years. And if you're working for the London School of Economics book review outlet, I think you should probably know who Thomas Sowell is at this point. So just the idea that, a person must hold a certain view just because of their group identity, or one person could do research which has a particular outcome that must favor their group identity, just seems like a pretty weak assumption.
Yeah, it is a weak assumption. It's not only that, but it's like, this South Sudanese community leader, John, I'm sure I pronounced his name wrong, Kuat, that the research should be taken out of context, and that he supported the research because it helps the community to identify where the focus needs to be. So, and that's the obvious implications of this, right? It demonstrates the importance of working on policies that address social disadvantage and social disconnection. It is disappointing the conversation has been diverted away from these issues, So people, there's potentially a really important reason to do this research. What if the research proved that it is a total media hoax and there isn't any overrepresentation?
Right.
I'm sure the research wouldn't have been called racist, right?
Right.
That would have been very helpful for people with that agenda.
Right.
And then secondly, if it does prove there's a problem, well then, why is that the case? What can be done to fix it? Because of course, these crimes are serious, not just for the victims of the crime, but these young African males committing this crime then go to prison because they're very serious crimes. And we all know that, what a prison sentence does to the likelihood of all these other issues you're going to have later in life. So, there's plenty of good reasons to do this research,
right?
Except for the potential accusations that you'll accrue and the damage to your research that it'll accrue, I guess.
Well, there's that, and then there's what I actually think is a genuine argument, and potentially on balance, I disagree with it. But there is an argument that all of this group identity research is inherently toxic. Because if the outcome is unfavorable to a particular minority group, it's going to be misused by politicians to discriminate against these groups. And the person making this argument would cite historical precedent of how people misused IQ studies, which found that certain minority groups had a lower IQ in the way that the researchers used to study it. There's a whole body of racist science which tried to prove that, and a lot of that has been disproved. Some of it still comes up every now and then. I think there's the famous study, the famous book, The Bell Curve by Charles Murray, and Charles Murray is still around, and there's a whole another issue about that. He doesn't get invited to universities and gets cancelled and deplatformed and can't talk about his ideas. But there is at least a genuine concern that this research has been misused in the past to persecute these minorities. So why bother going about it in a racialized group identity manner instead of just looking at crime and looking at other factors like employment, health outcomes, neighborhood, other things that aren't as radioactive as race. Do you see that argument? Like, does it resonate with you? I mean, I am trying to really bolster, the other side, because I can see the validity to that sort of argument.
But like you've just, I mean, like to be really clear, right? That whatever commonality there is between these violent South Sudanese boys, it's not going to be some fucking genome, right? So. Right. It's, I mean, in the case of South Sudanese migrants, it's fairly obvious fairly obvious. Well, there's some fairly obvious shared experiences there, which is that, this is humanitarian migration from one of the most war-stricken parts of the world, right? That the percentage of South Sudanese people that would be refugees and given would be enormous, and therefore the amount of extreme experiences that they would have gone through is huge, So
and not only that, but that's also compounded by the fact that when you come to Australia as a refugee, you're pretty much in the lowest quintile of incomes, the lowest.
Correct. Right. So then, exactly,
you're thrown into poverty, even though you've come to
public housing. You're
thrown into poverty, into gangs, into neighborhoods that aren't as nice as the neighborhoods you and I grew up in. Yeah.
Correct. And the schools suck and all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, if it was extrapolated out and you got rid of the word Sudanese, and it was like, if the statement was people who experience violence in their youth,
right,
or come from countries that are violent, are they more likely to commit violence? I'm sure the answer to that's yes. I mean, we know children who experience abuse are way more likely to become drug addicts and be involved in the prison system. So, like, that's actually what's going on, right? So these young Sudanese, particularly the males, clearly have some sort of shared experience that's really difficult, and we're clearly, not doing as good a job as we can of helping and supporting these people when they come here. So, that's. And I don't think a 17-year-old Sudanese kid who's decided to do some carjacking or whatever, his culpability, I think it'd be very, very easy if you were to, as you say, instead of generalize, dig down into the specifics of that person's life. I'm sure there's plenty to be empathizing with.
Right.
And plenty of understanding there. And also, I'm sure if you went through the whole narrative, you'd see all these opportunities that the migration system and that the welfare system, education system had to intervene and make this and help this person through their experience was missed, So, and hopefully that's what this research can be for, because you can say, oh, this South Sudanese race label isn't helpful. But in the way that they come to the country and then integrate, there is a process that's specific to them, right? And there is all this there's supposed to be all this institutional support specific to that experience. So in that regard, it is helpful. Do you know what I mean, Rob? But it's the point isn't the Sudanese. It's I'm sure it's the nature of the migration and the experience.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all that. So the again, just to push back into to provide the counter argument that I could see people making, if they listen to this podcast, or if they're just making this argument, is that I can see what you're trying to do. You're trying to use this research to potentially call out attention to some areas in the system that are breaking down, and to potentially drive some reform in these areas to improve the outcomes of these racial minority groups. But the problem is, whenever you do group identity research, it's inevitably going to be used to perpetuate extremely harmful stereotypes of, black people committing more crime, black people aren't as, I don't know what the term we want to use, but aren't as law-abiding citizens. They don't contribute to society as much as white people. Therefore, let's use this research to justify cutting off immigration from those countries. And then if that happens, then all of your noble intentions in doing this research are completely thwarted because, hey, now we just have a policy where these people aren't even allowed to come into the country anymore. So thank you very much. So what's the response to that?
I don't think the truth should be held hostage to people's capacity to exploit it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's how research should work. Like politicians can and have, in the case of Sudanese crime, chosen to exploit it and drum it up and create panic. I think that was sort of peak Sudanese panic maybe 5 years ago or something, Rob. I can't remember. There were even politicians in Sydney talking about it, and it was generally a Liberal Party used device. This, and you could certainly point to Islamic terrorism and that having massively bled into discussions around migration and nationalism.
Yeah.
The way to win those arguments is to, A, stand up for the reasons that humanitarian migration is important, that not being racist is important, that helping disadvantaged people is important, but also to do as good a job as you can of successfully integrating people into Australian society. So, there's two ways of looking at it. A, you could say talking about these issues means people are going to become racist because you're showing them that there's a statistical reality to some of these assumptions. But B, you could say people experience those things anyway. The media is going to talk about them anyway. The media doesn't have to publish its findings in peer-reviewed academic journals. It simply just gets to post and air videos and air whoever's opinions they feel like. And so this isn't some sort of ecosystem where if we take all the academics out of talking about the issue, then the issues won't be talked about. In my opinion, the issues, it'll actually leave the issue exclusively spoken about by politicians, racist people on Facebook, and media outlets that just care about virality, regardless of what the consequences of their discussions are. And so this is the point. If the research leads to improvements in the integration, that is, we do a better job of educating and finding employment and helping these communities actualize however they would like, then that actually takes the ammunition away. And so we do need to own and feel liable. And so my advice would be, when I read stuff like this, we shouldn't be, the instinct should hopefully not be, oh, geez, these Sudanese people are just out of their minds. It should be, why are we doing such a bad job of taking care of these people when they come here? And so if we don't address this, if we don't fix it, then the racism is going to be the only winner, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I also think these critics need to have more conviction as to what they actually believe in, which is that we're all created equal. I don't believe there would be higher crime rates based on particular groups due to their genetics, which is a pretty, it's not that determinative in dictating your behavior. So if you really do believe that, black people or people from Sudan aren't more violent or aren't less educated or aren't less productive, then you need to have the courage of your convictions to do that research and show that when these environmental factors improve, so when these people are given better schools, when these people are given better healthcare, when these people are given better environmental factors, you will see these group differences dissolve and potentially even point in the other direction. I know from some research in the States that migrants from Nigeria tend to outperform their white American counterparts in education, in income, and all these different things, because there aren't no you know, the fact that you're born in a particular country doesn't necessarily dictate, or the fact that you have, you know, skin color that you do, it doesn't dictate your performance. So the way you have your courage of convictions is by seeing this research come out time and time again to actually prove you right. Otherwise, you're potentially showing the, you know, soft bigotry of low expectations, is that because you expect these groups to perform so poorly, you just don't want the research to happen. It's almost like you don't believe in those groups to allow the research to happen and evolve over time. I was just talking to you before we recorded. I was curious on this point to see how crime rates change over time, how group crime rates relative to white Australian crime rates change over time. And I found a report from 1987 from the Australian Institute of Criminology, and the report's entitled Migration, Ethnicity and Crime in Australian Society, and it was by Kayleen Hazelhurst. And a quote from the report is that there were lower prisoner rates among Africa, Greece and Italy, and to a lesser extent Asia and UK, have kept overall migrant prisoner rates lower than Australian-born rates. So the study done, similar type of study done back in the 80s, and found that you know, the rates of crime from migrant groups back then were actually lower than the crime rates of Australian-born citizens. So, you know, there you have these group differences evolving and changing over time and based on different environmental factors and probably 100 other factors that go into this. So, you know, to know when you get progress and to know when things change, you need more research. You need more research. Otherwise you're just living blind.
Yeah, but you know, what if you wanted to argue the idea that a particular police force was racist? You would have to study that. You'd have to examine that and check that. You know, how would you know the difference between, you know, I've got here some of the data from the report, right? And so in Victoria, aggravated robberies, in terms of total offenders, so people of Australian descent, 1,460, Sudanese, 191, right? But then if I go to incident rate per 1,000 people, right? Australians was 0.4, Sudanese were 22.7, right? So the overrepresentation is enormous. Now, the total amount of incidents isn't, you know, 191, which is why, you know, this level of panic is, you know, it's 190 robberies. I mean, I feel bad for everyone who experienced aggravated robbery, but it's not like, you know, the world's being fallen apart, which is this other idea. But it's still, the level of overrepresentation is enormous. Now, it's important to be able to say that that's got nothing to do with the police being racist, right? Or what you could say also is that maybe a general racist experience creates people more likely to be criminals. You know, maybe that's, you know, I don't know how you would measure that, but maybe, you know, they come here, they experience racism, people assume them to be criminals and violent, and then that sort of social isolation contributes to people wanting to act out against the state and against people. Sure,
but what would you need to prove that?
Research. You would have to research it, right? So no, the idea that any research done with the right intentions can be utilized by racists is just bullshit. Like, yeah, so anything can be utilized by racists, but the more important thing is that people arguing for the truth and for what's right in the world are always going to be helped by evidence, you know, and they'll be able to explain things better and properly and more persuasively with evidence. So the research needs to be done, and we can't, you know, and I guess what's important to show here is that this Dr. Shepherd, being African, was still so terrified of doing this report, and then of course was seemingly forgiven after it being found out he was African. But you know,
so the person laying the charge of racism, I forget if we mentioned this, but she is an Indigenous academic. So it was a female Indigenous academic calling a male African, academic races, just in case that slipped by. But yeah, so she apologizes because he's black and then deletes her Twitter account.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting, right? It's like one of the criticisms she has about the journal was that it's an all-white editorial board that he published in, and that in her apology, she deeply regretted attacking his article rather than others that she might have singled out. But she just generally finds that the whole discipline of criminology is cooked, intolerable, and sort of dominated by academic whites.
Right.
The idea that community members and indeed academics examining something like South Sudanese crime ought to be of a particular ethnicity. I don't know. Does the truth look different does your objective peer-reviewed truth look different when the person conducting the study is black or white? I guess in this case it shows that for political and publicity purposes, it's really fucking helpful.
Yeah. Well,
it's really helpful.
Enough,
but
there's a way that we could prove that. We might need to do some more research looking at the race of certain academics who do this work, and then there's just an endless circle of who did that research and then who did that research, and it's a never-ending riddle. Well, I mean, this is the whole point of objectivity and the facts, so to speak, is they're independent of the race or the gender of someone, and if people are doing this over time, I do have a problem with there's something known in academia as the crisis of replication, whereby studies don't replicate time over time. So could that potentially reveal a bias, or potentially could that reveal some problem with the incentive structure in academia, whereby you only seek grants for new research and there's less prestige in using that grant money to replicate a study that has already been shown by someone else, and you would only be the second person to arrive at that study as opposed to doing original research, which is perhaps better for your cred. So there could be some issues of bias and some problems in academia, and that could relate to the crisis of replication. So
look, I'm sure,
but the point is you need to do this research.
I'm sure the overrepresentation of white people in academia skews the kinds of things that are studied and spoken about, and even the tone and the nature of the research. I would be entirely comfortable saying that that's the case.
Right.
It is interesting that academia is overwhelmingly weighted towards, what's considered the political left, regardless of this total sort of white saturation. So I would remind everyone that while academia seems to be overrepresented full of white people, it is also overrepresented full of very, very, very militant progressive white people.
Well, that actually does bring up a really interesting point, which is that we were talking before about unhelpful narratives. So, the unhelpful narrative that Sudanese are more violent is a reason why you shouldn't do this research. Well, she's only choosing one unhelpful narrative because if you don't do that research, another unhelpful narrative that comes up is that academics are all left-leaning, out-of-touch elites who don't call it as it is and are too politically correct to tell you the truth. And if you follow that down a few steps, that would that lead to less university funding? Would that lead to a complete crisis of academia and getting no research at all? So you can't really just as the critic of the research just say that there's only going to be one helpful narrative. You don't get to choose how many unhelpful narratives are produced by you trying to censor this research.
No, and people with an agenda will always find a way to make their agenda front and center, and they'll utilize whatever's available to them, and they'll pick and choose. You know, I mean, if someone
I bet there are some right-wing voices using this.
They
using
did.
the idea. Yeah,
They definitely
exactly.
did. They definitely did, right?
Yeah.
So I'm
The
pretty
idea
sure
of
Andrew Bolt jumped on
yeah,
this.
yeah.
And
yeah.
I'm sure they also jumped on the fact that Dr. Porter ended up forgiving him after she found out he was African. But
yeah,
it's I guess the issue is that if research, which is supposed to go through this vigorous process of objectivity and facts,
yeah,
is kind of contingent on the academic's ethnicity, you know, that's wrong. I think
that's wrong.
I feel like two things can exist at once: the idea that we need more diversity in academia and in research, that I 100% support, you know, and I'm sure that the major reason why there isn't as much diverse representation in academia has to do with social class and economic class, right?
Yeah.
So I think I'm sure, you know, most PhD grads come from, you know, more affluent backgrounds, particularly at the best universities, all this kind of stuff. So but yeah, I would absolutely support ways that we can diversify and include more people from more backgrounds in academia.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't then result in a situation where if you're doing research that might be considered controversial, you have to be ethnically relevant to that study. That seems to be its own form of bias that would actually pollute the quality of the research, surely.
I think the distinction has to be made between hard sciences, where you have data that's, you know, objectively analyzed and replicates over time, to the extent that a lot of these, you know, social sciences don't really get into the rigor that's required in mathematics or physics or biology or things where you can't lie about, you know, the compositional makeup of an atom, or you can't lie about the elements that are in something. It's there and it replicates. You can't lie about gravity, right? But maybe a lot of these sciences are exposed as fraudulent sciences because they don't replicate, and maybe there is a degree of bias. So I think the issue isn't necessarily the people conducting the research, because then you just redistribute the bias. The issue is the quality of the academic rigor that lies beneath that research. And so the goal, no matter if you come from it from a social justice lens or whether you come from it just to get a better chance at truth, would be to push the needle in the academic rigor of that field of academia, so that it doesn't matter if they're white, it doesn't matter if they're black or male or female. The data will be the data, and you won't be able to argue with that.
Right, and that's contrary to a little bit of this growing discourse around people's personal truth and, you know, their experience. And there is this, which I think is extrapolated in poor ways. Like and you know, because I totally understand the idea that someone who's, say, an Indigenous Australian growing up in Melbourne is going to have a very different experience than me growing up in Melbourne. And so that the idea that I could never really fully grasp what that experience is, that makes total sense to me. But the idea that then gives me an opportunity at every moment in life to point to that difference and say that, well, what I say stands no matter what. I think that's just when it's taken too far, right? And in the case of doing this kind of research, what you just spoke about is so important. So important. Like the idea that the vigor of this research is such that it couldn't matter who did the research. You know, that bias couldn't possibly be factored in because of how well bias is mitigated against the certainty of my research. Well, yeah, that would be.
You just need better research to do that.
Sure. Yeah. But I also do think that it's fair enough for people of ethnic minorities to look at a journal and see that not a single editor is racially diverse.
Sure.
And to lose trust in that institution. In the same way that it was fair enough for people to feel it unfair being in court judged by an entirely white jury. Like, that would be bullshit. That would piss me off. If I was an ethnic minority and I was exclusively, my fate was in the hands of my peers, but none of them were actually even my own color or my gender or whatever. So, I think having a level of suspicion in these old powerful institutions due to their homogenous whiteness is fair enough. And trying to destabilize that and provide more opportunities for young people from those minorities to end up academics and end up well-resourced in their education and potentially affirmative action to have diversification of the editorial boards in these communities is important. But that's not the same thing as saying anyone who does research on the Sudanese community needs to be African. That's too far. And what's frustrating about this is that the apology was given after finding out. And it's like, that, and to my opinion, that points to the lack of, I would then look at all of the research that Dr. Amanda Porter reviewed, and maybe this is why she deleted her Twitter feed. And I would say, well, what vigor were you applying to the research if the one time you criticized something done by a black person, you were willing to no longer stand for the criticisms you gave? You know what I mean? So, or its description of racist. So if something's only racist if something's racist when it's done by a white person and not racist done by a black person, and in this case it's research, that makes me feel like your claims of what racist research is or isn't is not really valid. Yeah.
And I also think we need to be extremely cautious about using this idea that, academia is white research or academia is like male research, because, typically, even the Nazis used to say that certain science was Jewish science. And, historically, a lot of, I guess, tyrannical movements or a lot of, the justification to place people into groups has a lot of that same language where you pretend anything that came from a certain group identity is inherently one way or another. And I think we need to keep the ideal of, as often as possible of, the ideal of objectivity and the ideal of, treating people as an individual before their group identity. Because I think these ideals, even if they're improperly implemented and haven't been perfectly implemented over time, it's much better striving towards ideals that are, everyone's equal before the law and that makes sense without having resort to someone's group identity. It's much more healthy for a society to do that than to be overly obsessed every single time on the, racial identity or, gender orientation of particular groups.
But there's a time and place,
Yeah.
And I think in the world of research that's trying to find answers to questions objectively, I would say surely most of the time in research, this idea of group identity needs to be limited, right? And not play a role. But, on Sunday, I was at the Italian Festival, Cullen Plaza. Right?
Good blog.
Had some beautiful cannolis. And in that situation, it's an awesome opportunity for Italians to express and represent themselves, or, in movies, in art, whatever it is, these other aspects of culture, sport, I think there's, it's not to say that, and, this idea of group identity is always poisonous, always problematic, always creates tension or whatever. It's not true at all. But in the case of important research, what role does it have to play? I think mostly it's just going to be bias and bias in the way it's received. So,
well, I mean, what I would just want from the critics is if they did think the thing was racist, I know the critic has retracted it now, but do studies proving the, lack of rigor behind that research. Tell me why he was racist, or support your accusation by showing me that your findings were different, and because you adopted these, more rigorous methods to find the outcome, and show me the bias that's what I think a lot of these people don't have any obligation to show me exactly where I went wrong and show me why this isn't the truth. I feel like a lot of these people can get away with the accusation without anything else. Now, fortunately, the Twitter thread was deleted, so we could have used some of that reasoning and fleshed it out.
But the other thing, Rob, and this is important too, is it's not enough to look at someone's ethnicity and then straight away decide that on that basis their intentions couldn't have been racist. So I made the point to Rob before off air. Just because someone's Italian does not mean they're going to get along and not have any biases against other Italians, right? If you know anything about Italy, you'll know this sense of national identity in being Italian is often less important than your region, and then less important than your little piazza village, right? So it's like
tribalism runs much more deep than your
tribalism runs very
identity.
deep. And you could say, oh well, he was African. Okay, well maybe I don't know enough about African politics, but I am sure that all of these countries in Africa don't all get along splendidly. And of course we know a lot of them are full of, experiencing civil wars and they don't give a shit whether
look at the relationship between China and Japan and different countries with Asia who hate each other and Burma
or Sri
and
Lanka
Thailand
and Tamils and all this stuff, and so in Italians it would be, Sicilians and Venetians or Calabrians, boy, and whatever else, all wanting to wage war on each other. So you can't just go, oh well, he's black, he couldn't have had. Well, maybe because he's Mauritian, right? So maybe he's Mauritian, but he fucking hates Sudanese people. I don't know. Like you can't just. So I don't know. It seems to be pretty for someone to be. Yeah, it seems to be a real throwaway. Just be like, oh, he's black, therefore he couldn't have had any racist intentions. Well. Yeah, I've heard my Italian family say many appalling thing about Italians from other areas. So you can't just that doesn't seem to be enough to me. So but that's this universe now. But it does seem to be the case that you're going to have a lot easier of a time doing this research if you're black. And to me, that sounds dysfunctional. You should have an easier time doing this research because of the incredible effort you took to being objective and professional in the research, not because of your race.
I am still yet to be convinced that we live in a better world where we have groups of academics defined by these people are doing black science, these people are doing white science, these people are doing Italian science. I am unconvinced that is a better world than the world that the project that we're trying to push forward, which is it doesn't matter your racial identity. It doesn't matter where you're from. Let's just appeal to ideals that we can all believe in: equality before the law, freedom, objective truth, free speech. These ideals that ideally should be independent of race. Obviously, historically, that's been inaccurate. It's been unequally applied. But if we can reach for the ideals and have science that's independent of race, my guess is that that's a much better world than one in which everything is group identities, black science, white science, Asian science.
Yeah, that's right. And, I said it before, but whatever commonality there is between these South Sudanese boys committing crimes, it's their experiences. And it's not, and part of the experience might be the racist experience of living in Australia when you're black.
And
and that could contribute to, I would probably say it's more likely got to do with the intensity of their childhood experiences and the whole migration experience. But the point there is, again, you'd be able to pull up these awesome stats which show that, regardless of race, regardless of class, children who suffer abuse, unbelievably more likely to experience certain things. Children who come from broken homes, children who come from one parent homes, children who come from all this sort of stuff. So, and the more we can, the more we can not use titles like South Sudanese or like migrant or and it would instead we would instead talking about some
More
sort of
productive
specific
titles. Yeah.
well, titles that were referring to a particular experience,
More
like
operative as to why it happened.
As to why it happened, right? So, for example, children who grow up in houses where the father is abusive,
Right. Yeah.
Say they grow up in domestic violence. What do we know about that experience? Well, we know that again, regardless of your ethnicity, the chances of the boys in that family growing up to be domestic violence abusers themselves is way higher, right? And that's the important statistic. Now, you can grab ethnic minorities and you can show how there's more domestic violence in those ethnic minority groups, right? But why is that the case? Probably because more of their fathers were like that. So the important thing isn't the race, the important thing is the experience, right? So now what someone would say to you is there are certain experiences in life that only happen when you're a certain race. That is the experience of racism, right? So there are experiences unique to these groups. There are, right? You and I haven't experienced a level of racism growing up that a black person would likely be subjected to. Absolutely. So that is a unique experience to them. But again, that's an experience of racism, right? So it does start to become a bit more murky when you start pointing to experiences that only particular groups experience. But I would say on average, I would say that generally the reason why people are disadvantaged in life isn't because of this, particularly nowadays, I would say nowadays, isn't because of some intense racially dispersed experience, but rather an experience dispersed through class and wealth, and that makes more shit things happening to you more likely. But anyway, I don't know if that, hopefully that made sense, but it's like I would understand why people would want to talk about the experiences of people rather than their race, but then people will point to certain experiences that only happen as a consequence of your race, and then you're back sort of where you started. So,
well, I think there's definitely a place for that. One thing that we didn't touch on is, and I think it's a hidden side of all this. You were briefly mentioning before that Italians hate other Italians, Greeks hate other Turks, Turks hate Greeks, and there is a lot of, same race on same race crime, same ethnicity on same ethnicity crime. So I think something that's just been completely hidden from plain view of this research is if Sudanese are disproportionately committing more crime than average, I would suggest, without actually knowing the research, but I would suggest that most of the victims are also disproportionately people in their community, right? So, like, why is it only viewed going one direction when if you can, if the victims are also more likely to be Sudanese, isn't that worthy of concern? And isn't that only something that we can know from the research? I don't know. I think it's better on the whole there is much more harm to be done from a lack of research than from an abundance of research. And I think the world's too complex to go through it without knowing what's going on. And unless we can do that, there's no way that we can move the needle on these issues.
I reckon that's the closing line.
All right. See you later, everyone. Thanks for listening.
I think they're all insane.
And one final thing, if you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word and let your friends and family know about it. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and notification bell. See you next time.